Hey, I'm Luke. Welcome back to building a full stack CRUD app from scratch. We are picking up with more front end authorization stuff. Like I mentioned in the last video, we're kind of in the weeds here because I was kind of reflecting upon the approach I took here, and I'm not the biggest fan of the approach I took. I mean, y'all saw how I wrote these fetch requests by hand and how I began building them up, talking about declarative versus imperative, single source of truthing, and whatnot. We're in this kind of like weird in between where until I get like these other couple parts written here, that everything still seems kind of it seems kind of, not redundant, but maybe like it doesn't seem clear to where we're going here. So let's go ahead and we're going to dive on in and keep on piece by piece putting this together, right? So, yeah, we had storage stuff taken care of. We talked about our base request happening here quite smoothly. We talked about uh, our auth service being on top of that to log in a user and keep things nice and simple for us, set the token and do some stuff for us. Looking good. That's what I like to see. What we need to also now consider is there a way we could store our auth status globally so we don't have to constantly check this validation uh, every single time we intend to go to a private page before we allow that private page to do something? And, it depends on the type of application you're writing. So you'll see tons of auth videos out there. There's some that I've watched recently that I very much enjoyed. I should have just bookmarked them. I'll try and find them in my history and link them in the description below saying, hey, this is good like auxiliary content that I enjoyed watching that taught me something about like picking what auth strategy is right for you. Like taking this bearer token, sticking it in this JWT rather, sticking it in local storage, attaching it to our requests whenever we go to a private page is fine. Like, if you want to validate your user every single time they go to a private page of any kind, that's totally valid. Granted, you'll have scaling issues on a massive or large scale project with tons of constant requests and maybe even database lookups happening, where that's where you begin to talk about streamlining these things via access and refresh tokens. So you're not constantly doing a database lookup on every single validation call. And for this scale, this project, I'm fine with just kind of checking the token expiration and validity when they first load the app. And there'll be use cases because I've done this on some of my other side projects. Like I have a workout tracking app that uses this approach, where I just load the app, and on the initial load and render of the app, when I open it, typically on my phone at the gym, it checks the token for validity, and if it's good, it just lets me continue to where I was going and start tracking some data about my workout. And there have been times where it expires in 10 minutes. So like 10 minutes into like the first or second set of whatever I'm doing that day, all of a sudden I try posting some data, and it says you must be logged in to view this page, and I'm like, ugh, so aggravating. But I mean, that's just the way the cookie crumbles, right? I think I set my expiration for like 30 days when I don't know why. I could totally do it for like 60 days and be fine. But we're going to take that approach here. We're going to be setting up a slightly more advanced React API here. I'm not going to be reaching for something like Redux or Redux Toolkit, even though I talk about them in my React course. I'm just going to be using vanilla React API called Context. I haven't done it with TypeScript in a while, so I might just be resorting to a lot of :any's to get it working. Classic stuff. And we'll see how we can take context and get a provider and consumer to be our entire application. And I'll talk about the caveats of that as well. And again, I go into great detail about all that stuff in my standalone React course. Check the description below for the link to Covalence to find that if you're interested. Okay, so, like I've been rambling about, at some point in time, we need to set up some kind of global auth state that my app and any child component of that global auth state can read into it and see what it has to do, because it would make sense that if my auth state changes, my entire app should re-render in some form or fashion. There probably isn't a whole lot of private stuff that needs to still be viewed if my auth state is switched to false, right? So we don't have to worry about a lot of unnecessary re-renders, because they probably should happen on something as large as my auth state triggering from true to false or something like that. So, we've talked about building out these folders here between what are components, services, utilities, views, and whatnot. Here I can say that maybe I'll consider it a utility for now, and in future, like if I have lots of custom hooks and context and whatnot, I may consider moving them to separate files and folders. For now, I'm just going to move it into my components folder and make a new file, and we'll just call this the auth provider. And technically, it will be the context as well, but we'll get into that here in just a moment, right? So Writing a provider is going to be using the React context API. Now, context, you'll hear like context and reducer, use reducer. Those two hooks together can replace all of Redux. And it's like, it achieves, yeah, a global object state that can be referenced by any child component wrapped in this provider. But Redux will prevent a lot of unnecessary re-renders, whereas context does not. It just re-renders every child it's wrapped, which can be a very taxing thing on a large scale application that has tons and tons and tons of child components that don't need to re-render with one top level state change, right? Redux can help prevent that, whereas context just re-renders everything as of this video being recorded. But you never know, maybe in the future they provide a way for that not to happen. But as of right now, that's the big advantage to Redux, even though technically they'll achieve close to the same thing, minus the being able to select pieces of state and prevent child re-renders. So we're going to be importing our handy dandy function here from React. It is called React create context. That's all it is right there. Creating a context can have a default state that you want to provide for it, or it can be an empty object. It doesn't really matter what your context is. It's going to be basically the shape of your state for whatever you intend to use this context for, right? So a lot of the times you may see something like this. I'll call this auth context equals create context. And we'll just pass a blank object for now. I know what shape my state is going to be. Like in other projects, like if this thing is going to be involved with a custom hook, sometimes I'll do this particular syntax right here, where my initial state will be an array with an object in index 0 and a function at index 1. And that represents something I might look like if I did one of these. Right here, where I did like an ES60 structure on a useState call like that. I pass this as my initial state, which represented by values, and then I have a setting function called setValues represented by this here. So a lot of the times when I do my context, I tend to just kind of make my initial, you can just do your initial state right here as is, but I'll show you all what we're going to do here in a second. But that right there is kind of what I'd be mimicking right there. So like my create context will typically be like an empty object if I don't know where I'm going with this, right? So, okay, we're actually going to need this context elsewhere across my project. So I'm going to choose to export this one as a named export because we're going to have another default export coming from this file here in just a moment, right? So this is where we're going to start. Now, from here, I also need to have a component, and we're going to call that component here. I've been doing arrow functions, right? Yeah, okay. I like how I keep having to double check that. Yeah, you know what? We're going to copy this component because it's going to be very, very similar. So head to one of your components that's super small and simple and copy it because we're going to paste some of that code, delicious code right there, right? So let's just return anything at all. There we go. Beautiful stuff to return. Lovely, lovely component. We're going to call this, not navbar props, but we're going to call this the auth provider component, just like that. And what are we upset about here? Oh, okay. So yeah, in Create React App and Next and things like that, they have code written to where you don't have to import React into the scope of this project in order to access JSX syntax. But in my current project, I don't have that quality of life written in, so we do have to always write import React. And you saw that this is saying, the arrow was telling me basically like, hey, it looks like you're trying to mix some HTML into your JavaScript, and you need to like tell us how that's going to be done. So I'm like, oh yeah, I gotta import React right there. So classic little blender right there, right? All right, so this thing will actually be rendering everything it wraps as a sandwich, right? So where are we going to use this provider? Well, first thing we're going to be using it is going to be by wrapping our entire application, kind of like what we did with Browser Router back in our root application here. So I'm going to go ahead and choose to add it to my import list here and go ahead and wrap my application with it and then finish out coding it here in just a minute, just so y'all can see what it looks like when I import it into app and use it in that regard. So we're going to say also bring in our auth provider component. I'm going to cut these out and wrap this whole thing in auth provider. And now all children of the auth provider component should have access to a global authentication state, I have yet to write, that will trigger everything to re-render. So like if some piece of state in my auth provider changes, all of its children, aka navbar, and every single route I'm going to be building in this project, in this playlist, will re-render if they're currently in the DOM, which means that's a huge optimization chunk to re-render everything, but I think something as big as authentication status changing should trigger something that large. The navbar should probably, go from something that shows that you're logged in, like welcome back, Luke, to, hey, log in or register buttons instead. Whatever route I'm on needs to determine if it needs to reroute back to a login page or if it stays on a public page or something like that. So where Redux would not have every child re-render, only the ones that are listening to a particular piece of state would re-render. Things inside of providers, which are called consumers, aka the children of your context provider, all re-render. Okay? Unless you provide optimization with them. Not to, but that's a lot of work. But again, something like auth, that makes sense for a full re-render. Okay, so now that we know the ultimate goal of this auth provider, which is wrapping all of our lovely looking code here to inform at a global top level scope accessible to any child what the auth state is without having to prop drill. I failed to mention that. We do not have to get some state from the auth provider, and we're not going to have to provide some kind of prop to all of these components that we have to then keep on passing down via children. That's called prop drilling, where I'd pass some state information into home, and then home provides it to its component, to its component, to its component, to its component, to some login button that needs to display when we're not logged in. That's called prop drilling, and it's totally fine, but can be kind of hard to maintain and know and follow the lead on large scale projects. So the React Context API is a cool way to avoid that. We can provide a state that can be read by any one of the children. So right now, our lovely provider isn't really doing anything, and it doesn't set up any kind of state, and it doesn't run any kind of validation, so let's start changing up some of that. I need to provide some kind of state, and I need some kind of check to happen on my initial render of the application that will be asynchronous, so I need to make sure that I run that inside of a use effect while the application loads and does something. Okay, so just like with the rules of hooks, we need to make sure that, what's it called? Why am I blanking on words now of all times? We need to make sure that hooks must be in the top level scope of any React function component. So there we go. I don't know why that was so difficult for me to say. Here's what our state structure is going to look like. It's going to be an auth state. We'll say authenticated, which will be a true or false value. I will say on initial load, we're going to assume or presume false. And we're going to have a checking Boolean that will also be set to true by default, because again, this should only run on the first render of our application, and once we validate that token, we should be good to go. Now, TypeScript is smart enough to, as you can see from the IntelliSense tooltip, recognize what our state is, which is an object with two properties, authenticated Boolean, checking Boolean. And if you wanted to, you could come here and write it explicitly. Again, like I mentioned, TypeScript is a bit of a spectrum. I'm working solo here. I'm not opposed to any's keystring strings, or keystring booleans and things like that. But for this one, I'll go ahead and write it out. I'll actually write authenticated boolean and checking boolean. They're going to be always present and always booleans no matter what. Like I said, TS was smart enough to infer that state type, but we're going to go ahead and practice adding a little bit more and more TypeScript as time goes on. Okay, now that I have my state set up, how can I possibly share it amongst my children, right? So children are accessed via props that are automatically built in for us via React components. So if I reference the props.children of my auth provider, props.children references all of its, children, aka navbar, and all of my routes should have access to this as children of the auth provider. They are typically provided in vanilla.js as just props.children, but we can actually code them here ourselves. I think this is how it's done. It's been a hot minute since I've done this, so apologies if it's not happy with how I choose to do it. But yeah, props.children, we can say they're going to be any other React nodes, okay? Anything that's safely renderable, or rather safely returned from a React function component. You can return a number, a string, JSX, other components, and arrays, but you can't return objects, for example. So that should theoretically work, and we're going to see if it does here in just a moment. Because as of right now, if I go to my DOM and refresh, we just simply get the auth provider because we haven't provided an outlet for our children to render yet. It just says the h1 what. It has superseded rendering everything else by not providing to let the children render. So to do that, we're going to replace the what with props.children. And I don't see TypeScript fussing at me yet, but that'll be remain to see. Let's see what happens now. Hey, we're back in it, folks. Look at that. If you look at our component dev tools, which again, if you don't, I think I mentioned these, but if you don't have these, you go to the Google Chrome store, extension store, whatever you want to call it. Chrome extensions, there we go, words. And then look up React Dev Tools and even the Redux Dev Tools and go ahead and install all those things. Even though we're not using Redux, it's nice to know websites that are using it. I like to poke around and see how they build things. But yeah, now we have things that are slightly more complicated with our auth provider now providing some kind of props that will be a state value to all of its immediate children, aka our entire application. But there we go. That's how we can render our whole app from props.children. Now, while this application is checking, maybe I don't want to render the whole application yet because it's currently checking what's going on, right? So I'm going to say if my auth state.checking is true, I would rather you return an h1 that says loading for now. And we'll replace this with a fancier looking component down the line. For now, this little loading text or a spinner or whatever you want to do is totally cool. And I have no logic to say toggle over once you're done checking the state of my, or validation of my token in local storage. Just tell my user that my application is loading while that happens. So now we have our return some JSX if we're currently loading something. Once that is toggled off, we'll then return our application, or we can always say, if it fails, to reroute them somewhere. But for now, we're going to keep it simple. Just check it, and that's it, right? And either we'll set it as true or false, depending on whether it passes or it fails. So here we go. I need to run a use effect that does this logic on the initial app load. And I mean, we could argue that it should happen other times here, but forget it. We're going to keep it simple for this the scope of this playlist. We're going to say just check it on app load, on initial render, and then never again. So the initial render will technically be this h1 loading when anyone first comes to my application. It'll render that. This will then fire, validate the token, and then either reroute them or just render whatever they need to see on the page as is. So here we go. To do that, I'm going to bring in... actually, no, wait, hold on. In our services auth, I don't have any logic to validate our token here, do I? As a matter of fact, I was talking about that at the end of the last video where we need to move this to some kind of centralized location as well, because clearly we're going to have to know how we're going to authorize our token here. So let's go ahead and add that to our auth services. Here we go. Should be fairly simple. Like I said, when it came to this component here, I didn't really care if what the response text was. I only really care what the status code was. So in this case, we're not going to parse any JSON bodies in the same way. I'm simply going to write const. We're going to call it validate token is an async call to this function. No argument should be provided. It needs to run a try catch block. I want it to daisy chain any error up to make sure it is properly caught in my promise chains down the line here. I need it to attempt to validate a token. Yeah, so it should just be await base service.get to the path was auth validate me. Yeah, so auth validate and me like that. It's just a get request to this particular route, and that's all it is. Yes. Okay, so from there, if an error happens, it should throw it from that particular thing there. Remember our base service.get. If we go and look at our base service get request, all it does is it makes a proper get request to our JSON function here. It will set up our token if there is one, so this will automatically set up the token for us. Because it has a method of get, we don't need the content type or data body, and it'll make that request and go forward. It will throw an error if the response status code is not okay. So because I throw an error, catch it here and throw it up the chain, it should be caught here. If this fails, like with an error status code, if it's not okay, that should also error and throw an error, which means my provider can have a use effect that uses the .catch to run some logic successfully. At least that's what I'm assuming is going to happen, unless I'm overthinking it and missing something somewhere. But it should be as simple as this. If this resolves the promise, token's good. If it errors the promise, it should be bad. Okay, so let's add that to our export list here. And we're now going to bring it into our auth provider successfully, hopefully this time. Import auth service from the up1 services auth file. Okay, now that I've got it, let's hook up into our use effect. So I'm going to say, hey, code, I would like you to auth service dot validate the token. That is a promise that can either resolve if they are successfully logged in, or error if it has a bad status code. At least that's what I'm assuming is going to happen. I don't really care what the error message is, but I do care to simply say, in the event that a catch happens, set my auth state as the following values. I want it to set authenticated to be false because they have a bad token. Either it's expired, it has a bad signature, or something has gone wrong. And we are now officially done checking my auth state. Okay? If it succeeds, a good status code, then I want to then set the auth state instead to be authenticated true because the token is good to go. And the checking is also, it should be false, not true. And checking will be set to false because, surprise, we are done checking the validity of that token via this request here. And as you can see, like I had said, this is much, much, much cleaner by setting up some services and things like that rather than writing all of our fetch requests by hand, because that stuff can get pretty nasty when you have a lot of business logic mixed into your components, which is why, even though it felt kind of really windy in yesterday's video of why I'm taking the steps to do all these extra like layers of abstraction into service files and utility files and whatnot, it's because that their payoff makes your components just crispy clean looking, right? And that's what I'm all about. Righto. So in the event that it's done checking either way, the loading should turn off and it should render my application. We could always, in this instance here, always write some logic to re-navigate them if we want to as well. That's a possibility. But yeah, it should happen pretty quickly, so you don't really even see the loading. You see it flicker there for a second, which is fine. Your users probably won't notice it, or if they're on slow internet, they will see a loading right there. So we can simulate the auth service by either throwing it into a delay or something like that, right? So we can see how long it takes to validate that token, because there should be one in local storage. Yeah, I couldn't visit this page if there wasn't a valid token there. But I could always do something like a set timeout and say only run that code, let's say after 2 seconds has passed. So this is just forcing the auth state to be set slower after the promise resolves. So I'm going to refresh the whole application. It's going to do the initial render of my entire application, which will start with browser router, then auth provider, and then all of its children will be ready to render, but it won't render them. It'll render the loading part of my auth provider. The use effect will then fire after the initial render. It will then validate the token, resolve the .then in the promise because the token is good and not expired. It will then take the 2 seconds on the set timeout before the state update changes, checking, setting to false, authenticated true, and then rendering all the appropriate children. That's the workflow of this whole thing. So hard refresh, here we go. 1,1000, 2,1000, state change, there we go. We take a look at my components and take a look at auth provider. We can even see that the authenticated state is indeed true because it validated that token successfully. Let's go ahead and now change up my local storage to be clear so there is no token and refresh this time. I have no logic on my set timeout for this one down here to see if it's true, so let's go ahead and do that as well. Set timeout to run that code also after 2 seconds. Give it a second to recompile and rebundle. Okay. 1,1000, 2,1000. We know that there's no auth token because I screwed it all up. That's fine. Looks like I'm double logging somewhere. Or that might be the strict mode stuff happening right there, which is why everything's rendering twice. But yeah, let's go confirm that in my component dev tools that auth provider is at authenticated false and not true. If that was true right here next to my elbow, that would have been bad because it would have validated, it said, oh yeah, this token's good when there is no token in local storage whatsoever. If I go, I can't go to private because I'm unauthorized, but if I log in, I can now go to private successfully and we're good to go. But that's interesting because now I need to tell it that I've logged in because as of right now, it has no clue that I've done that. So if I go to components again and click on auth provider, we see it's still false. So on top of this login button logging me in by setting a token to local storage, it also needs to access that this global auth state somehow to tell it to update authenticated to be true because, well, it is now, right? So that's something we're going to have to take into consideration here. And there's a pretty cool way we're going to do that. So like I said, all of the children of my auth provider, again, my whole ass application, right? Dead ass, the whole thing. They are children of this thing, which means they should be able to access any value from my provider, which happens to be state. It doesn't have to be state. It could be a ref. It could be a number. It could be a variable. It doesn't matter. Like whatever data you want your provider of context to provide, it will. Okay, so that can be static values. It could be stateful values. It could be a reducer. It could be a ref. It could just be a variable you've created up yonder called lols that you pass all to your components. The point being, this provider should, well, provide something for its children to consume. And it's done that. We can do that by writing something from our auth context to set this up. I'm going to head down here, and in replacement of my divs, I'm going to replace them with, why did I delete all that? With my auth context.provider component. This component is coded for us and has a particular prop called value that we can pass in whatever it is all of our children should have access to. So if I pass in a string value of LOL, that's all it is. We have whatever this value is can be provided to can be read by any child of auth provider, which once again is the whole application. Let's see how this might actually impact or work as an example here. So we're going to call our useContext hook, right? So clearly, if this component can consume some top-level parent context, how do we consume it? It's done via two things: the useContext hook and what context we're looking to consume, which happens to be the one I created up yonder, right? This one right here. So what we're going to do is import my auth context from that file. Utility. I was like, where the hell did I put it? Didn't it? No, I made it a component here. Oh my God. All right, so components, auth provider, import that auth context, because you can have multiple layers of context or provider components that provide different layers of context across an application. Thankfully, we just have one to worry about. Again, all things hooks, top-level component scope of the function component. What does this variable represent? The variable we call this simply represents this value inside of this prop. It happens to be a string called LOL, so I'll call it the lol string equals use context, what context? The auth context. And bada bing, bada boom. Let's just go ahead and render it directly into this header and see if she worked. Oh, what's this here? The JSX tags children prop expects a single child type of React node. Oh, so it thinks, oh, that's right. So here's something screwy. Because I told it my context is going to be an empty object like that, it's going, yo dog, you are trying to render the one thing I can't render, which are objects, because you can render undefined, just nothing there. You can render null, nothing there. You can render numbers, strings, booleans, all that stuff. Well, booleans won't appear, but numbers and strings just appear. Arrays will just be smacked onto the screen, which is why the array map method is so clutch for React coding work. But objects you can't render. So it's telling me that, hey, lol string is of type object, so you can't render it, you dummy. So let's change it to be a string value instead. Now TS is happy with me because it recognizes that the auth context is a string. And oh, let me go remove those set timeouts. But yeah, check it out. The component home, right? No tricks up my sleeve. Look at that. I don't have a prop being passed into home there. I didn't type something off screen when y'all weren't looking or edit via a pause or something like that. I'm not passing a prop into home, but it has access to one thanks to the context, right? That auth context, giving me a simple and clean looking string to use here. That's it. That's all it needs to do, which I think is, well, pretty dang cool. Yeah, but that doesn't really help us here too much, does it? Just a simple string value. Maybe it does. I don't know. Maybe that's what you want your whole application to do. How about we do something a bit fancier instead? So I'm gonna go back to what I was saying is it's going to provide eventually an object and a function as the context being provided. I know this is going to be angry at me again. We'll fix it here in just a moment. Now, what do I want it to provide? I want it to provide these variables right here. The values that my use state is already giving me, I want it to provide them as values down yonder. Yeah, would you look at that? So now I provide an array of my auth state and my set auth state updating function, which means home now has access to those as props via use context. So because I chose to do an array, There you go. I can just call them whatever I want, just like we're simulating a use state. We're basically hooking into a parent's, get it? Hooking into a parent's auth state. We'll say cool auth stuff is the object, so we'll say .authenticated. It won't recognize it, but that's okay. We'll deal with that TS error in just a moment because, again, I told it should be a blank object up here. That's fine. If it's true, we'll render logged in. If it's false, we'll render logged out when we get that far. I'm going to tell TS to shut all the way up for now. I don't know if they'll work in JSX like that, will it? What if I just do a no check? I'm going to do a no check on this file real quick. So it didn't. Hold on. Boop. Come on, TypeScript. Maybe I don't have. Do I not have logic to tell it to ignore this problem? Whatever. It doesn't really matter. I think maybe it needs to be at the top of the file. Yeah, that's what it was. Okay. So I'm going to do a quick TS no check to get the error to go away because I know it should be fine. That Boolean value should inform us whether we are. I need to remove those timeouts. Logged in or logged out. So you can see where we're heading with this, hopefully. This global auth context I can hook into it via a use context into any component I want. Any component I want, right? And now I can know whether I'm logged in or logged out and do appropriate rendering from or rerouting from there. That is a massively cool and powerful tool to have in an application like this. Cool. Okay. So in terms of these functions here, let's fix up the state values. Like I said, because my state's not going to be dynamic, I can get away with just providing an initial state that already is those values, and I could tell it that the context, the create context type will be, this is so messy to try and read. I guess I pass them here, and I provide what the two values will be, because now this function doesn't technically represent that anymore. What is this set auth state? Oh my god, look at these types. So nasty looking. So I'm using my IntelliSense here to tell me what that state type is, a React dispatch to React set state action type of that type of object. What a mess. Maybe that's not where I provide how to do this. No, I know why I screwed up. It's an array. It's an array. I done messed up somewhere, Aaron. Hold on. Ay. Oh, I thought I had it. Y'all. Where's the screw up? There is definitely a typo somewhere that I managed to incur. Okay, I need to close set state action and dispatch. So was it actually 3? I'm invincible. All right. So here's what we did to fix all this goofiness. I called create context with a type of an array because it's going to be of an array just like useState. I told it that that's going to be the type of the object of index 0. This is going to be the type of the function in index 1 when we get that far. So these are placeholder. This is directly what the state's going to be. This is a placeholder function because I don't have my useState actually generated yet. So down yonder, I call my useState, I set up my logic, and I pass them into the auth provider. They're now available in home. And as we can see, the types are there. I turned off my TS no check, and my authenticated knows it's a Boolean. We fixed it, folks. Let's go. That's what I'm talking about. All right. Yes. Okay. So from here, you might be thinking this really isn't. That's pretty. All right, first off, I think this is pretty dang cool. I ain't gonna lie. But there's actually one additional step we could take to make it even cooler, if you believe me, which you don't have to if you don't want to. But, this is what we're going for. We can actually take this one step further by, and again, like having to bring in use context as an import, the auth or whatever context, in our case, the auth context import, and setting up the use context line and then doing like a useState ES6 destructure from there to do whatever logic we need to have happen. Not all that bad. It's pretty easy to figure out what we need to do from there, and it's not a whole lot of extra code, but we're going to ratchet it up one extra notch by making a utility for ourselves called useAuth. And if you're wondering, Luke, if this is a function, a custom hook, why wouldn't you call it useAuth capital case? I've been burned too many times on a Windows OS, switching and working, collaborating with a Linux guy, Andrew, my co-instructor here at Covalence, or dealing with my students on Mac OS and things like that, and having issues where they provide like bad file names that don't work on Windows. I've been burned so many times by like a git change on someone's OS not recognizing a capital file name changing. It won't recognize it in Git, and their production deployment fails because they're running off an old build that's not recognizing a file case has changed. I'm so sick of all that garbo that I tend to just do lowercase and hyphens on things that are not React components. As you've seen, React components, I typically always do capital letters. That's just a convention I've always followed since I learned Create React App like 6 years ago. And then from there, I tend to stick with lowercase kebab because it's not steered me wrong as of yet. So that's it. So a couple things here. I want this to simplify this whole process I've done in Home of importing a context, importing the use context hook, setting it up, and doing some logic for me. So what we're going to do is we're going to write import use context from React. This is not actually going to be using any JSX, so that's why it's not .tsx and why it's also not going to be importing React. This is just going to be solely a custom hook. How do you make a custom hook? It's nothing more than a function that follows the traditional hook convention of use and capital case X, whatever X term happens to be. For useAuth, it's going to provide no arguments. All it needs to do is hook into that context. So we're going to say it will gather those values from my context, which, if you recall, was from import auth context from my auth provider component, and bring that into this context. Okay? It's going to return one value at the moment, and we'll have it called whether we're authenticated or not, right? I want it to return to me the state of whether we're authenticated or not as just a simple Boolean. That's all. So as you can see at the moment, this particular hook as of right now, and a lot of the times our hooks are named exports. So even though I've been doing defaults, I'm going to follow a more hook style convention and make this one a named import. So why am I doing this? We'll add more logic here later, but for now, if I go home, I can now remove this. I can now remove that, and I can bring in my custom hook. Use auth, please, from utilities, use auth hook, and now use auth, and now ES6 structure, authenticated, and would you look at that, we now have a custom hook hooked into a React context with global authentication validated state across my whole application, and anywhere I need to know what's going on, I bring in my custom hook, I destructure the authenticated property, and Bob's your uncle, and Robert's your father's brother. You're done. That's what I love about this stuff. Is it the fourth time I'm saying it now? I gotta get rid of the set timeout. Go away. I'm done showcasing that. They know what's happening. Boom. Fixed. Okay, there we go. So yeah. We now have a global way to do that, which I think is pretty dang cool. Now, as you saw there, it didn't recognize I was logged in because we still have no logic on this login button click to, well, sign in one of my users. And we can do that a couple different ways. Watch this. I could, if I wanted to, just simply provide a property called setAuthState in tandem with authenticated, just kind of like lowbrow it here. So what does that do for my login component? Well, first off, let's go change a couple things up. Yeah, that's what I want to do. So now, I'm going to, how do I want to do this? Yeah. Import useAuth from my utility file there. Please go ahead and use auth in this component, destructure set auth state, and voila, I can now update the state of my authentication in my login component. So I can tell this child of my auth provider to go up to its parent and set its state, which will re-render the whole application. And when does that have to happen? Right before we navigate. So I can say, hey, before you navigate to the private page successfully, set my auth state to be whatever it currently is, because I don't want to mess with checking, even though it's only one property. Whatever checking's value currently is, which should be false, and authenticated to true. Why am I doing it this way? In case my auth state ever grows in properties, this will at least be a way for me to not have to go to all of my components and rewrite my state updating code, which we'll handle that here in a better way in just a second. But there you go. That right there is one way we can handle that. So watch this. Before, all right, it knows I'm logged out. And if I clicked login and went back to home, it would not recognize I'm logged in yet. But now, not only have I logged in by signing in with those values, getting a JWT in response, putting it into local storage, I have now also told my global auth context to update as well, because we have that available in any component we see fit, which I think is pretty... I really felt like I leveled up when I figured this stuff out back in the day. So hopefully y'all are also like, bro, this is good stuff, man. Yeah, this will kind of bump you that tier from beginner to like breaking into the echelons of intermediate React dev if you start to figure this stuff out and follow these kinds of patterns. But remember, the big caveat of context is all of its children re-render, which means this whole thing re-rendered when I did that state change. But that's okay, because it's super small right now, and something as big as auth should probably trigger a pretty large re-render for an application, right? All right, how can we take this one step further? Still, you're saying, Luke, there's more. But wait, there's more. So what we can do is we can even handle some navigation stuff here if we wanted to. So I can even say import use navigate from React Router DOM. This should work. Browser router... It should work. We're gonna see if it works or not. And if it doesn't work, I'll try and explain why, because I have one hang up of why this may not work the way I think it does. Let's make a function, a utility function here called sign in. That looks wrong. Sign in. Is it funny that when you write something like a ton of times, or you take a second to actually think about how it's spelled or look at it, it looks wrong? Whatever. Okay. Set auth state. Like I said, we'll do that same syntax by capturing whatever the previous object values were to make sure they are maintained. Authenticated true. After that state change happened, I would like you to navigate to whatever path we provide from our component. So now instead of providing the whole set auth state, I can now provide this utility function called sign in that will handle that logic for me. So back in login, instead of having to do all this, I can now destructure sign in, replace navigate with sign in, remove set auth values, and go back to a nice ES6 shorthand one-line return. And would you look at that? That looks pretty clean right there, and it should work the exact same way. It's a utility function that abstracts that information away from this component once again to my custom hook, and that's where it really begins to ratchet up in awesomeness here. So nothing in local storage, refresh, logged out, clear those errors out, login, it reroutes to private like it should, and it also updated my global auth state, and voila. Dude, context and custom hooks are some of the coolest combos that you could do in your React projects to, once again, signal to individuals that you know yo shit when you can do stuff like this. Yeah, like I said, context and custom hooks is my jam. All right, we can also make one here for logging out while we're at it. Make a logout utility function. Logout will set my auth state. Let's copy and paste. Who am I kidding? To false. And it should also clear my token. So we're going to import storage. This is why I hate mixing and matching defaults and names. I should just stick to names only, man. Come on now. Utility storage. It should set that state to false. Storage dot clear. Oh, am I messing with namespaces? Okay, remove token. Navigate to login if they click on a log out button somewhere, which I currently don't have. Alrighty then, and we're going to add that to my list of exported features right here. Cool. So let's test it. Let's see if the logout function works by going to our private page, bringing in my useAuth hook. Oh, please tell me I'll just autocomplete here. It'd be pretty cool if it does. Const equals useAuth. Yes, autocomplete. You are the best. Bring out that logout function for me if you don't mind. Okay. And let's make a div that has a button that says logout. That on click will run after the click occurs a call to my logout function from my custom hook here. And there we go. I think that's pretty dang cool, y'all. Let's see if it works, shall we? So I am currently logged in, confirmed. No problems, no errors. Click on private. I get there, click on logout. It takes me back to the login page. Now the final test. Logged out, private, reroutes. Let's go! I've surprised myself that I managed to one-shot this in a video and not have tons of errors everywhere, looking like a dang fool with my pants on the ground. But like I said, as we're progressing here, hopefully all the loose threads of yesterday are kind of beginning to, show you like paint the picture I'm trying to paint here. That's redundant. Hopefully you're seeing the picture I'm attempting to paint here with everything I was doing yesterday, setting up like all these fundamentals of like the goofy auth stuff, the central way of calling fetch requests, the central way of handling tokens and whatnot. We laid all that groundwork, which seemed very scattered and piecemeal yesterday, and you can see where they combine very quickly and nicely in these other pieces of the puzzle, and ultimately we end up with just super clean, juicy looking code in our components themselves, right? So like we've learned from our private component here, we don't need to run this code anymore, so we don't need to get the token. Because again, this was not a great way to handle authentication if it simply just exists or not. We actually wanted to validate it, right? And we don't want to have to include this code inside of every single privatized view or component or whatever, right? Like, surely there is a top level way, like we did with auth, to deal with that. Now, technically, you can make the argument that this property should tell us whether they should be here or not, right? So this use effect is no longer needed whatsoever. The token is no longer needed whatsoever, because if it got this far and authenticated is not true, then we should be redirecting them, because technically they're not logged in. And look at that. We got rid of that. That's gone. That import's gone for now. Look at that. Like, look how much cleaner our code winds up being when we start doing these kinds of like service and utility files that help move business logic away from component, aka view logic. Very common pattern. I'm repeating it to get it inside y'all's thick skulls, like it took me a while to get inside my thick skull. But yeah, technically this authenticated property would be solid enough to trust, because it had to validate that token to know whether they can be here or not. And check it out, folks. Refresh the project. Private reroutes me. I'm considered logged out, reroutes me, I log in, I get here just fine, and I can stay there just fine with no additional fetch call. So now, every single time coming to private, it no longer has to make a fetch to validate, Now, some projects, you want that. Some projects, maybe like if you're building like a bank website, then you're probably not working with local storage and JWTs anyway. You're probably doing sessions, right? But if there's some website where you do have like authentication concerns and you do want to validate every step of the way, there's nothing wrong with making a call to validate the token on every single button click as they go through like a step form or something. Maybe that's what your authentication needs are for that project. For this one, I'm fine with one top level check to tell me if I'm logged in or not, and trusting it from there until it tells me otherwise, right? But yeah, that's some pretty cool information to know. So it could be as simple as this, but surely there's another way we could do that. And there is. We can actually make a private route style component. So I don't like normally doing this when the project's running. It should be fine, but I don't like renaming files while a project runs. I mean, it's technically in the view here. So how about we rename this to profile for now? And we'll rename it from private to profile. I'll have to update my view index to now say profile. The import path already fixed itself. I'll now have to update my app component to tell it is now called profile and no longer private. Oopsie. That'll be profile and not /capital profile. And you don't even need the leading / anymore with React Router DOM v6. It'll just automatically add those there for you. You only need them if you're starting to do like child routes and things like that. But yeah, let's go back to our nav bar now to update that as well, because this should now be /profile. This should say profile instead of private. I'm renaming this because I want a component called private route that'll end up being, well, the private route logic. So yeah, I can close out of the app, close out of that, close out of my index. We're done goofing around in home. I'm going to get rid of authentic. Well, I'm going to leave that because it's just cool to see, to show y'all that the global state's working how it should. This is our profile page. Looks good. Looks fine to me. Yes. Okay, so like I said, let's make sure everything's working still. Uh-oh, well, it's not because I forgot to restart my app. So rerun dev. Hey, yeah, okay. We are logged in so we can view profile. Hey, there we go. All right, so there we go. We changed it up because, like I said, we're going to make a new component called private. The purpose of the private component will be to render or renavigate any component that we should be able to authenticate and view. Again, we are basically just moving this logic out of this component so we don't have to remember to add it to every private component, right? We'll see what I mean by that here in just a moment. So, like I said, we need to have my useAuth custom hook. We're going to be using a declarative approach of React Router DOM's navigate component, and it's going to be nothing more than a call to this. Now, here's where I'm not sure what's going to work the way I think it should or not. I have no clue how it's going to want me to do my React children for my TypeScript props. So we'll say interface private props. I should have just copy pasted something. Props colon private props. Okay. From there, we're going to do what I've done before. Just double check to see if authenticated is true from my useAuth call to my custom hook. If we are not authenticated, you know what am I doing? I can just copy and paste this garbage. Boom. What is not happy here? Oh, there we go. Nope, that's not from that. That's not from that library, is it? Classic. I'm so used to working in projects that have that quality of life already added for me. Otherwise, return whatever I was going to return, which is going to be my props.children, which should be React node, and here's where I'm not sure it's going to like me or not. This will be fine for this component's sake, but when I go and actually use it in my application, my app.tsx, that's where it may not be happy. I don't have location here as well, so this doesn't matter too much, I suppose, but let's go ahead and just add that logic in so I can be consistent. Like that. Use location. I'm weird, so I'm actually going to swap my imports there. I always like having libraries up top and my custom ones below. Okay. So there we go, looking good. That should be fine. Yeah, I mean, that should be all we need in this component. It should be fairly straightforward and simple. Like I said, it's the TypeScript types I'm worried about when we actually use it. So I've now, the whole reason I renamed profile is because now I can get rid of this stuff. I no longer need it in this component. Yoink. Just kidding, I need auth for the logout button, but I don't need the location data anymore. I don't need this if statement anymore, so there's even less goofy looking business logic in this component. There we go. Don't even need authenticated because I should have figured that out by the time I got here. There you go. Nice and clean again, right? I'm going to close out my login component just to clear up some of these things here. Don't need useAuth open anymore. Don't need auth provider open anymore. We're done there. All right. Where is this private component going to work? Let's add it to my list of exports. Like that. Because it's going to be working at the route level in my application itself. We're going to have our private component. And here's where I'm really not sure if it's going to like me or not, but we're going to find out. We're going to find out, aren't we, folks? JSX.element. I'll have to remember that. We're going to say render a private wrapper around my profile component. There we go. Right? So yeah, now if we go to the route of profile, it should first run the logic in the private route component, which will attempt to check the current state of authentication. If we're not currently logged in, it should reroute us. If we are logged in, it should render what it was going to originally intend to render, which is the profile component. The profile component will be like, hey, if I'm rendered because I'm in a private route, I don't need to check anything. It should be done before I even get here. So now, any part of my application that will require an authenticated state to have validated, that needs to be wrapped around the component. Okay, so after all that mess and no TypeScript errors, surprisingly, let's go ahead and refresh the... Yeah, so this is why we need a single source of truth for client-side and server-side routes. Like, they should be reading from a JSON file. I said that last time I did this. There we go. Yeah, I need to have some kind of other way of doing that. I need to have some other way of reading this single source of truthing these paths between front end and back end. We can do that with a JSON file, but I'll set that up later, or when it screws me over later in a different video and I'm like, I should have done that before, and I'll do it again. I'll do it again, I swear. Let's try it again. That's what I thought. We are currently logged in, so profile is good to go. And check it out. Like, if we're not logged in, let's see what happens. Home, we're gonna know we're globally logged out. I click on profile, and it reroutes me. Cool. But I did not pass any kind of information to the reroute, though, did I? I said, because I didn't, where did I, oh yeah, so let's take a look at that, because now the location from logic has changed. So as we can see, it does not have my error message that says, you gotta be logged in to view this page, sucker. Let's go find out why. We're going to go to the private component, and we're going to go log what's happening here. Because the location, yeah, because the location. I wonder why that location didn't trigger the way I thought it would. Let's log location, save, refresh. Yeah, I know that. Oh, because it's no longer private. I'm so stupid. Back to login. Yeah, because it said what? Private, right? Profile. This is also not a good idea to do it from the path name. I should just say, if I got rerouted here with a stateful message that says you must be logged in to view this page, let's just do that, right? So rather than saying from location, we'll say from location, and we'll also say state dot maybe message. You gotta be logged in, sucker, as the state dot message of this reroute component happening here, right? So yeah, the path name for location was the same, but because I changed my path name from private to profile, you can see that it is not a good way to scale this information here. So I can say if state.from.message is true, then display that you must be logged in, sucker. Otherwise, don't, well, actually, I can display the message itself, couldn't it? So I can just say like that. Or I could always just add a Boolean rather than this message. I could say rerouted, and I can say, yeah, like rerouted true, or like login reroute true, use a Boolean instead of a string value. But, you know, this is a way we can centralize what the message is if we get rerouted, I suppose. I mean, that's one way to think about it, right? Interesting that it's still not doing that here. Okay, well, let's link back the component, take a look here. Righto, so what are we looking at component-wise? We are looking for my login component. There she is. Location. Dot state. Oh, because not on dot from. Man, I'm making tons of... It's an hour long, that's why. That's why I'm making these dumb mistakes. It's location.state.message. That's the value we're looking for there. So if state or message are falsy, it won't render this, meaning on a fresh refresh. No, I remembered it. Remember that? I told you all that it remembers this information, surprisingly enough. Yes, it remembers previous things, information like that. A fresh route to login or refresh now, we're fine, right? So a fresh reroute to login, totally fine. Forced reroute, message appears correctly now. That's how we can centralize that information there. I'll get there eventually. But yeah, it's up to you how to do that. Maybe a Boolean will be easier, and to say if you got relogin or something like that. But yeah, that's some cool trickery for us. And as you can see, our components are so much nicer and cleaner the more setup we've done with global auth context, utility files, a custom hook, learning about the React context API and all there within, and a private route component, how all this information gets so much cleaner and easier to use. And in the next videos, we're actually going to be building out the rest of our application via a registered new users view. We're going to be actually building out our notes, adding notes, editing notes, and viewing notes, CRUD operations finally, because we've covered all the kind of more, I don't know, groundwork stuff that I wanted to get out of the way before we started cruising through the easy parts, which are just getting all the notes and displaying them, showing a detailed view, adding new ones, editing and deleting from there, right? So there we go, y'all. We've done some serious work today for some incredibly cool content. Hope y'all like this video. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Give me some feedback down below, and I'll see you on the next video where we do that, where we start adding the actual whole purpose of this dang playlist is adding some DnD notes in the React web application. My God, we've taken forever to get here. Peace.